The issue of chemicals in the environment is a story about science, politics, and humanity's relationship with the planet. My name is Chris Hughes, independent scientist, and this is the Chemical Journeys podcast. Join me as we uncover the story of chemicals in the environment through conversations with individuals working in this space. So, let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the Chemical Journeys podcast. My name's Chris Hughes, and I'm here today with Peter Fisk. And I'm really excited to have Peter on the podcast because, Peter, you've had a really long and successful career working in the area of chemical risk assessment and policy. And I know that in that time, you've accrued a lot of knowledge and wisdom on the topic. So I'm very excited to see where we go with this conversation and the topics that we'll cover. So let's kick off with a bit about your background. Why don't you, first of all, tell us your sort of career journey?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure. I guess I was always, back to school days, an out-and-out scientist come mathematician, and with actually also quite a lot of interest in languages, which I think shares a lot with what we do in the scientific world, because we all have our own languages in the disciplines that we inhabit. But yeah, so I had a great chemistry teacher, great maths teacher, some of the best teachers that I ever had. And I went to Oxford in 1974 to do chemistry. I realized that maths at university was far too much like philosophy, which wouldn't suit me at all, and had superb teachers in classical mainstream chemistry, not diluted with anything apart from the maths that you need to do chemistry in an analytical, quantitative way. I was the kind of chemist at university, and subsequently that I would like physical chemistry. Inorganic chemistry was okay. Organic chemistry, I would probably be the person that threw the product down the sink and didn't keep the and thought that the waste was what I wanted. So that kind of hands-on white coat stuff was not really my strength. But I went on to do my PhD that was spread between Oxford and Imperial College for various reasons, specifically the kinetics of reactions and processes occurring in two liquid phases. So, and then when you think forward to the whole world that we inhabit in regulatory chemistry, where so much hangs on something like octanol water partition coefficient, I was looking at how fast those things happen in two-phase systems back in 1980-ish. So that was very interesting, very mathematical in the way we approached it. And I went on from there to work for the company that was then called Ciba-Geigy, which then merged and split many times. But the part I was working in was on corrosion inhibitors and scale inhibitors for them. And I was there for about 5 years between Manchester and Switzerland. That was fun, but for personal reasons, I moved down south and started working for Shell at Sittingbourne in Kent from 85. And I was there for about 10 years until the day it closed. In the first 5 years, I was working on physical chemistry support to discovery, and started to get involved in quantitative structure-activity relationships and molecular modeling. Back in the days when your molecular modeling computer was the size of a room, and in its infancy, really. My main area was still physical chemistry, and I guess a typical company, there was cake and there was icing. So the cake was doing the routine properties that you need for regulatory purposes or for understanding, say, structure-activity relationships. You measure the partition coefficients of 30 different analogues of a certain substance that the organic chemists were working on, for example, that kind of thing. And the icing in those days was to try and develop QSARs for mode of action of, and I was working on pesticides mostly. Then we also did basic physical chemistry for the petrochemicals area, just at the time when in the early 80s, under the regulations that preceded REACH, property data sets had to be measured. And we had good labs, and so we did them. After a while, some of it we had to subcontract because we didn't have the explosivity test facilities or this kind of thing. And so when Shell got rid of its pesticides business, I kind of gravitated into petrochemicals. And so there was more and more of regulatory work. I didn't really know much at all then in the early 90s about the regulatory area, but started to learn more. And that's when I first came across somebody you're probably interested in, Dr. Steve Robertson, who was working for the Department of the Environment at the time, and started to get to know him and all his insights into ecotoxicology, and started to then learn more about ecotox and to a certain extent biodegradability testing. So it's kind of moving into mainstream regulation. Then in the early 90s, Shell decided to close down the Sittingbourne lab. And I could have moved with the job to Chester, or they said, here's a whole bunch of money and it's this much. And it was an amount of money that was eye-watering. And I thought, actually, I've been thinking about going it alone, and here is my financial ticket to do that. Peter Fisk Associates was started in about 1994. And first, two major things I did early on was very broadening. One was for the Department of Trade and Industry, was called the Chemicals Regulatory Atlas. And the idea of this, that DTI, as it was then called, would produce a book that was very glossy, but pre-internet, you have to realize. It was a very glossy book, but it was designed to help people in industry understand what's this new substances notification about, what's the Water Framework Directive, and so on and so forth. Where does it all fit together if it does? And that was one project I did, which required a certain amount of imagination to express that as a road atlas. It was written in those kind of terms. Then the other thing that I did was to work for a well-known publisher at the time that produced loose leaf books of chemical data and reviews of chemical regulation. So that was, I have no idea if that is still in existence, but I did work on that for a number of years. And then I think the connection with Steve Robertson became interesting because in about 1997, probably, his various members of staff all left or got promoted or whatever, and he was left with nobody to do the UK's environmental work on notification of new substances except himself. And so he took me on as a consultant to help, which lasted for 4 or 5 years probably, and led into other kinds of work. So I guess that's the kind of phase one where it was really very much me. Hadn't started employing people up until about that time. So I've given you a bit of a monologue spiel here about the process. I guess the thing that's all through it is the physical chemistry theme. So, and it's where I still am all these years later.
Yeah. you definitely have had that thread running through your whole
Mm.
career, haven't you? And you've turned that aptitude or that appreciation to many different functions, which is great. That's the work of a consultant in the end, isn't it? To repurpose what they know and to find ways of solving new solutions.
Yes, and you need to adapt to the different tools and the different um, atmosphere
Mhm.
of the way things are done, and so I think that we saw really a transition in the 2000s once we knew that the regulatory white paper had been published by the Commission, and we knew that REACH was coming, and we all had expectations of what REACH would be. By then, I was employing a few people. This change was coming about national authorities not having much to say, and so we saw. I use the word carefully. We saw a degrading of the skill pools that were present in the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, in particular, had strong skill pools in regulatory compliance. But all that was then centralized through REACH. Once we got to 2007, 2008, we could see that the world was going to change.
Mm.
And
If I can interrupt you there, Pete, I mean, that's really interesting what you say about the national authorities' sort of infrastructure and skills sort of deteriorating. I think one thing that we can maybe explore in this conversation is your experience of these early days of Reach, because the public record is very sparse in terms of what was actually going on in the 5-10 years, running up to Reach, and how did key decisions get
well,
made and things like that.
I think the perceptions are just based on one's own experience, they're not objective.
Hmm.
I think I do remember, and I will certainly not name names, but I do remember somebody from one of those competent authorities that I mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
and this person said to me, Peter, you know, and this person was working in ECHA by then,
Mm.
you know, it's not the same. Yeah. And by that, the person meant what we used to do was the regulators, and I would sometimes, as a consultant, interact on behalf of the regulator with industry. The regulator was accessible to the industrial registrant, so
Mm-hmm.
you could get advice. And
Yes.
that was what went in the early days of ECHA. And I haven't interacted at this kind of level for several years, so maybe it's changed. But the whole atmosphere changed. And I think
Mm.
that Steve Robertson, as has been
Mm.
recorded, people's regulatory decisions had an impact upon real jobs in real companies in real places. It wasn't an academic exercise to examine people's data sets and to advise about toxicology or whatever. But this did actually impact upon the world of business. And that whilst it's, of course, right to be totally even handed with everybody and operate a completely level playing field, of course, that does not mean that you should imagine that industry is doing anything other than its best to make a living. There was a fear, I think, with some people that industry is trying to pull a fast one over
Mm.
regulators. This has simply never been my experience. There's not some things that I could imagine that could have been done better, but I never personally experienced people from industry concealing anything or doing anything other than their best, really. So,
Was
and
that a
I,
product, do you think, as well, of the collaborative spirit that might have been there? in the
I
90s?
think it's just the vast majority of the people involved in regulatory submission from the industry side and the regulators and the NGOs, we all come from scientific backgrounds and we all behave like scientists.
Mm,
And it's how so many people from industry have been able to move into regulatory authorities perfectly seamlessly, and the other way, because you
mm,
are on doing the same thing with a different person
right.
paying your paycheck. And the idea that it's warfare between
Mm,
us and them is um, mm, far more exaggerated than it actually is true.
mm,
Because everybody, in the end, everybody wants to be able to sort of meet at a conference, have a drink, have a chat, and not be embarrassed about something. Yeah, not that we're all too friendly. I don't think it's happened like that. And I always had the view that if the data are the data, then if I'm working for an industrial client and being industrial in orientation from the word go, if I'm working for an industrial client, I am not going to say something different about the numbers than if I was working for the regulator. And the difference was compared to the early days of Reach anyway, was that you could ask for a meeting with one of the competent authorities and
mm,
say, well, we're registering a new substance in your country, and we'd just like to tell you what we're doing. So to comply in the best way possible, could we have an hour's meeting just to look at this substance? That kind of thing happened routinely, and then that disappeared overnight,
mm,
um, which I think was understandable but unfortunate.
mm.
So
Do you think that was more of a product of just the fact that it became gigantic and it was impractical to have that kind of a dynamic? Or do you think there was some level of political kind of pulling back going on?
I really don't know.
Hmm.
Sorry, I don't.
Yeah, no, it's
I
fine.
don't know.
I can understand it would be impractical for ECHA to be on the phone to every member state to address questions and challenges, especially when they were foisting a hugely complex regulation and obligations onto everyone. But certainly, some of the things in the past few years have been quite unsettling, let's say, in the way that the discussion has become so polarized.
Yeah, I think that's regrettable, and I hope there's some degree of drawing back from that. But I think there were quite a few different things going on. One would have been in the early days of Reach. Echo would not have been able to pull together people of sufficient numbers with sufficient experience. And so that made people more cautious because they were still
Mm,
learning. I think that also industry started to get extremely skeptical because when the white paper that preceded Reach was being written, there was a lot of words about read across, quantitative structure activity relationships, understanding groups and classes of substance, and making the best use of existing data and trying to avoid repetition, especially of animal studies. And then in the first few years of Reach, when I was by then had quite a large number of staff and quite a range of skills, the whole range of skills that you need, what we found was that ECHA's reception of QSARs was lukewarm to cold
mm,
on the whole. Read across became, read across between very close analogues became impossible, or where you were trying to perhaps stop doing a long-term animal test because you'd done one on one substance and the other one that's almost identical substance, you would say, well, I'm going to read that across. And then the read across arguments were rejected. And then they would say, well, if you want to read this across, you've got to do the following to prove it's valid. And
mm,
then the following to prove it's valid is actually more work than doing the animal test. certainly in money, maybe not in terms of number of animals. So a huge amount of suspicion developed because having been promised that read across and QSARs would be tolerated, accepted, encouraged, they were suddenly being turned back. And the amount of testing grew massively. So I'm certainly not suggesting that ECHA was in those days not compliant with the law or anything like that. They were scrupulously compliant with the law, but the burden of proof was set at a level that was virtually impossible. So you've got to write more than a PhD thesis to justify a read across. So
overly precautionary interpretation of the precautionary principle, or the very nature of it being subjective.
I think there was a lack of scientific understanding, to be honest. The risk of sounding very critical. If you've got a molecule that's been proven to be highly degradable and not bioaccumulative, and you've got another molecule that's only about 2 carbons different, but apart from that, it's identical in every way, and scientifically, the route of degradation is going to be seen to be the same by anyone who understands degradation, that should not be turned down. But those kind of proposals for read across were being turned down all the time. That's 8 carbons long, this one's 10 carbons long, you can't read that across. Why? Well, because we say so.
Yeah.
and no, you can't have a meeting to discuss it.
Yeah.
Huge amount of skepticism grew, and so barriers grew. So it was, I think, the first round of submissions in 2010 through to 2013 bred huge amounts of, I think, and if you were coming from a background of being against animal testing, you would be very concerned. It's not just about the amount of money, but the amount of testing that I would personally have no hesitation calling unnecessary was huge. And the problem was, as I said before, the barrier was set so high. You would have had to use more animals to prove that you shouldn't read a tox test across.
Yeah, there's probably a fear of being inconsistent across different applicants or registrants. At that time, the guidance was, although the REACH guidance is really unrivaled in its scale and scope, it was still sparse in that area. And we've seen more recently guidance emerge to address these particular things. I do wonder whether they've really improved the situation in some cases.
No, well, I think several comments there, Chris. One would be, one of the justifications for REACH was that the old regulations were too slow in acting. The old regulations were producing results faster than REACH is producing answers on risk management. So that objective of speeding up management of seriously hazardous substances has not been better than the old system. So that was really a failure. And the answer to this failure seems to have been to say that everything should now be hazard dominated rather than risk. And the idea that we were originally thinking that risk-based assessment was going to be important, just as it was in the previous regulations. And then we suddenly saw that risk-based assessment was not happening, and that far more hazard-based assessment was being done within the authorities, was again a feeling of a feeling of betrayal compared to what the white paper originally said in 2007. Although I haven't looked at the white paper for many years. But so I think that to me is a huge concern, because certainly going back to the old days under the notification of new substances, we've got an unacceptable risk of this substance based on its current use pattern even on the basis of what we know. So what we're going to say to people is, you've got to reduce the amount of releases, otherwise we'll have to impose controls. And what seems to happen now is, oh, well, we're going to ask you for a long-term test of toxicity in soil, sediment, this, that, and the other, just because we feel like it, not because it actually is going to change the outcome. And so it's maybe that's being slightly cynical, but the tendency to sort of collect data was not going to change the conclusion. An ever-increasing move away from risk-based assessment to effectively what is a hazard-based assessment, or people would say with certain types of substances it's not possible to quantify risk, but moving more and more towards hazard-based situations. And I find it quite astonishing that certain types of industrial intermediate, where there is potentially exposure of workers, are being subjected to extremely expensive animal studies, where in reality we can write down the name and addresses of the people who are actually working with the substance. The company knows who is doing that process, and that there is the potential for some degree of exposure, but we've moved to a situation where there's another barrier that's too high. In the past, we would have been tempted to say, look, this is an intermediate that's being used under highly controlled conditions. People are monitored. We really do believe that there's no exposure. And we've got monitoring studies that show no exposure, but nevertheless, or a quantified low exposure. But we cannot ever say that control is complete. But so the authorities went through a phase, and I don't know if it's still the same. Well, if you can't say that the control is complete, you've got to do these long, 90-day study. So you're doing a 90-day animal test for the sake of 5 men and women working in a plant who you know who they are. That to me seems to be something that's happened that was not expected. And I do find it sad that even in my interactions with people in industry today, the amount of mistrust between authorities and industry is far higher than I ever experienced 20 years ago. And I find that to be very sad, really. So I don't wish to sound too negative, because there are some really excellent people working in the authorities, but it seems that the system has moved and moved towards a degree of caution. Where is there realistic caution? And so I see, as somebody who spent 20 years writing environmental risk assessments, I see the sort of move away from reasonable risk assessments towards hazard-based approaches, find to be sad, because in the end, something might have a horrible effect, but if there's no exposure or negligible exposure, then the risk at some point has got to be considered acceptable. I'm not trying to defend, say, for example, PBT substances, or especially the ultra persistent substances. Something that's got a half-life of 10,000 years should not be made, full stop. That's just quite simple ethical issue. You can't bequeath to the subsequent generations a load of chemicals. You just can't do that ethically. You're not going to be here to carry the can, are you? So I suppose in a way, I feel that in the world of regulation, there seem to be more and more people of high quality working for industry and authorities to do their best, but we don't seem to be getting good, despite the numbers of people, we don't seem to be getting good decisions quicker. In fact, we seem to be getting doubtful decisions slower, just through too many people and not enough real focus. So at the same time, I think there are always more positive things. For example, the Commission is spending money on things that are quite progressive, for example. So I think that's a good thing.
Are
But
you referring to things like safe and sustainable by design?
that would be one area. I think the Commission also spent quite a lot of money on reach for polymers, and
Mm.
yeah, that clearly was a gap that the authorities should have been quicker in deciding which polymers should be subject to regulatory processes, whereas currently, as I understand it, they're more or less exempt. And as far as I know, although I worked on a project in a team for the Commission where we put forward some very specific proposals about reach for polymers, as far as I'm aware, it's not progressed as much as I would have hoped by now.
Mm.
You might be able to tell me where it is.
Well, I think it all hangs on what's going to come out of the revised reach revision, right? Which is as part of
Okay.
this new commission. But from my own experience, discussing the kind of the challenge of registering polymers and the complexity of the portfolio of polymers on the market really dwarfs the complexity of the registration of individual chemicals, at least in the way that REACH is intended to operate, which is based upon no data, no market. Individual organizations have to get together and register the same product whilst minimizing animal testing. We were at a place where we don't even know what's on the market. So
Yes.
how we could be in a position to then register, group, given that all polymers have complex composition, devise a way of grouping them together and then registering them.
Well,
It made your head
uh,
hurt when you were thinking about that during the last round of the chemical strategy for sustainability.
yes, I think there are reasonable solutions there based on molecular weight that would reduce the discussion massively. But once you get to a certain molecular weight, which isn't that high, there's no biological uptake unless you believe something might have some kind of surface activity.
Mm.
So you can rule out the vast majority of those hundreds of thousands of polymers on the basis of molecular weight and lack of solubility straight away.
Yeah, yes, but Peter, unfortunately, the way that
So
environmental persistence is interpreted is such that bioavailability wouldn't be taken into account. To refer back to what you'd previously said about long half lives, those other polymers might still be seen as an issue, and everybody's got their own hobby horse when it comes to these challenges, which I think made it very difficult for authorities to come to a pragmatic solution, especially with the way the political wind was blowing at that time.
yeah, so um, anyway, they introduced the reach for polymers thing, just an
Mm,
example of where the commission did spend money on having people discuss and plan and think about it. Um, so yeah, that's a good thing, and the
mm,
commission, to some extent, ECHA, but I think the commission has done a lot to look at big issues. I think, for example, I was a co-author on a report about what are the molecular properties whereby a PMT substance could be a long-range transport hazard, and that was commission studied, and we came up with
mm.
conclusions that actually showed that certain substances that hadn't been initially trapped by the Stockholm Convention methods could have been trapped if with a slightly more um, nuanced approach to the properties. So I think there are areas where I think the Commission has spent money in some quite useful areas over the last 15 years. So I
I
think,
s-
yeah, and ECHA has spent a lot of money on things like developing the software, like
mm,
for risk assessment purposes, and
mm,
these things have been helpful.
mhm.
Uh, So, the improvements over the years in the Euclid, uh, these are showing, these are reasonable things that people have done. So I think there are some positive things, and certainly in respect of safe and sustainable by design, I think it's been quite a number of things that the Commission and others have done in that field that are helpful. And I'm very excited to be part of a small part of a team that's won a project with the Commission recently to look at the development of, shall we say, centres of excellence for people to get advice. I think to say more than that would be premature because the project hasn't even started yet. But
Right.
I'm
Oh,
sure it's not, I'm sure it can't be secret because although there's a kick-off meeting soon, so who the contract was awarded to must be public by now. But
right.
So that project will be interesting, and there's another project coming that's actually coming shortly to an end about what are the barriers in respect of safe and sustainable by design. Has been looked at several times. So these things are very welcome, and I think this recent one that I'm pleased to be a small part of, I think will be very exciting because I think the European Parliament and the Commission have recognised that with all the best will in the world, industry has not found it easy to introduce substitutes. Why is that? What can we do better to? The European Parliament has a very bold wish expressed in legal terms, that hazardous substances of any sort should, in the long term, disappear. So, remarkably bold and perhaps naive, but nevertheless, the Parliament is supporting the Commission in this new project.
Well,
So I think
congratulations, first and foremost, on
it's not me. I'm kind of 5% of the team.
the bid candy, as it's sometimes referred to.
Yeah. So the world has certainly changed a lot during my time
Mm.
working in these um, regulatory matters, and something that I feel hasn't advanced as much as I would like is that the European Union. I tend to speak somewhat in a pre-Brexit way, I'm afraid,
Hmm.
but I can't avoid that. But I would have liked to have seen more overlap between the people doing the Industrial Emissions Directive and REACH. It's as though they're two different worlds.
Yeah.
And then you get a third world of the overlap between REACH and the Food Standards Agency, where in some areas there's massive overlap, but quite different approaches. And although people in the Commission talk about one substance, one assessment, they've not really been able to get beyond generalized political statements yet. What it
Mm.
actually means in terms of real collaboration and unity of understanding of any individual substance seems to be a long way off.
Mm.
And I think so. The authorities sitting in their little silos seems to me to be sad. And I've no doubt industrialists sit in their own kind of different silos too. But uh, when I was doing work for the Department of the Environment years ago, when we were writing with organisations, Peter Fisk Associates was doing it, and also BRE was doing it, writing exposure scenario documents that ended up being published by the OECD. And there was a lot of prior art from these other parts of the EU infrastructure. There was huge overlap between understanding industrial methodology for different types of areas, and we tried very hard to sort of collaborate and build bridges But it still seems as though in the EU, and it's also true, I'm sure, in the UK and the US, people will defend their patch, even if it might be better in the end if there was one patch instead of three. No one wants to give up their control of one of the three. and
Yeah, well, yeah. I think you might be
so
right there, but I think that's a natural human instinct, isn't it, to guard your territory, and especially if
mm.
merging would mean consolidation of departments and
One area you know well, I'm sure, is in the oil industry. And I think that the oil industry, as expressed through Concarway in Brussels, who did a lot of work for in various times,
Mhm.
um, and the interaction between Concarway and the European authorities was always particularly good. And I never quite worked out what Concarway had that worked in terms of its approach, but it did work in terms of influencing in a good way guidance and understanding of complex substances. And so, whatever trick that Konkawi had in terms of collaboration with the authorities, I do feel that many other sectors could have learned more from. I think metals have been particularly successful, and
Mm.
although metals are not particularly my strong point, I've worked for the metals sector a bit, but not as much as organic chemistry. But metals people have done particularly well, I think, in influencing regulatory direction. And
Mhm.
Concarway did. And I know you look at the world of Cefic, and a lot of money has been spent through the Long Range Research Initiative and other things. But I was always very admiring of how Concarway had done a lot of basic work that could help regulatory direction, and I was involved in some of that back in the days of when I was still working for Shell. Goodness me, back in the early '90s, a lot of interaction with a number of colleagues at Shell who are very strongly involved with Concarway and interacting with the then European Chemicals Bureau. Um,
Yes.
the European Chemicals Bureau still exists, of course, but the in those days the European Chemicals Bureau was doing it all. But
Yeah.
before ECHA, um,
I think the comment you made about Konkawi, well, there's probably several elements to it, but surely their size and resource must have had a part. And given that you had great scientists from the different companies that were working on these challenges, but probably more so was the fact that there were such enormous challenges to doing the regulatory evaluation of petroleum substances due to the nature of their composition, the so-called UVCB, substances of unknown and variable composition, complex reaction products and biological materials, we're still we're still tormented to this day, both industry and regulators, to adequately evaluate and risk assess UVCB substances. I suspect that industry's willingness to weigh in and do that work that was done in the early days to address these challenges would have been well received, and the regulators and the academic
yeah,
community might not have been
I guess
in a position to make the progress that was made early on.
that's why I think when people say that polymers are extremely complex, I say, well, yes, so is the oil industry, and but the oil industry did find a way. I guess the thing is about Concarway as one organization representing all the different streams, whereas you can't find a single body that would represent the entirety. There is no such thing as the polymer industry, and
Yes.
so that would make it a lot.
Yeah, and similarly with
Uh,
Cefic, I mean, it's fragmented, isn't it? There is Cefic at the top, but there's all the different
and
sector groups, right?
it is difficult because you might have a sector group that's dealing with, say, one type of flame retardant for one type of polymer. So,
Hmm.
and there's another part of Cefic that's representing a different type of chemistry that's going to be flame retarding a different type of polymer to achieve the same physical end. And so you have different parts of Cefic where the internal sector groups are actually competitors with each other. And so Cefic can't speak with one voice very easily. It is difficult. But I think my Konkawi experience overall made me feel that there are ways of industry interacting with the regulator and NGOs that can be successful. It's just hard to do, and sometimes you need a nasty combination, which is high levels of scientific ability, high levels of people skill, and a heck of a lot of determination. And it's not always easy to pull all those things together. So
timing is important as well, right? You need to be in the
yes.
right place with people willing to talk.
So looking forward, or going back to the story, so in 2020, I decided that to be doing something different, and running a company of 35 people was becoming too much work. And even though I had fantastic help and a great team, I just needed to do something different. And the directors of Peter Fisk Associates took it on, and then a couple of years later they renamed it Vitis Regulatory.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I'm aware, they've been very successful in doing so.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not involved at all for various legal reasons. So, but one thing that they did not want to do was to be involved with, shall we say, sustainability, green chemistry kind of ideas, whereas I'd always had an interest in how you apply molecular design ideas to not just new effect chemicals, but also new effect chemicals that were green or sustainable. But the snag is that I've not wanted to do it as a full-time job. And so I think that's quite inhibitive. At the same time, I think that there's a huge dampener on discovery, because bringing to the marketplace a new substance at the level of, say, above 100 tons a year in REACH terms costs you not just your development costs or your marketing costs, but you now have regulatory costs, which are perhaps as big as or more than some of those other costs. And so it's hard for people in industry to say, let's move away from substance X that's got these problems, that's maybe not as green as others, or it's got a bad classification. And people look at that and they say, well, we can still sell it. We can still manage this old substance. So why should we spend that money and make that effort when it's not guaranteed we will even make enough market inroad to justify it? I think I've certainly had this discussion with big and small companies alike, that it's just simply too financially risky, and especially with wider economic challenges. And when you've spent a lot of money getting a REACH compliant dossier, it's extremely tempting for people to want to carry on selling the substance.
Yeah.
Even if it's got a tricky classification, can we still manage this?
Yeah.
So I think that the truth would be that the amount of inroads I personally, through my company, Green Chemical Design, the amount of inroads that I've made has been disappointing compared to my expectation. But that may partly reflect my own lack of time spent pushing. But at the same time, I can see where there's been perhaps more progress is where it's possible to identify existing substances that can work maybe nearly as well, or formulations of existing substances that could actually do particularly well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so if you can formulate two existing REACH registered substances to do the same job as something that's coming under scrutiny, that might be a more cost effective form of innovation than saying, oh, let's invent a totally new molecule,
Mm-hmm.
which is time consuming and expensive. So, in a way, a fully compliant REACH registration at high tonnage is a pretty valuable thing to have. And so, how many more ways can you exploit what you've got is the way people are thinking. And I've been quite enjoying one area of science in the last few years that started probably 5 or 6 years ago, working with the so-called Hansen solubility parameters
Mm.
as molecular descriptors, because they work really quite well as descriptors of hazard, but also of performance. So the majority of people that use those parameters, HSP as they're called, do so to try and understand performance. Whereas I've been able to show in a number of areas that you can show that the HSP also relate to hazard. And I did put out on my website at some point a nice graph which shows all the classical PBT substances all sit in a certain place in Hansen space, where you need to have high lipophilicity, but also some degree of polarity in the molecule. And that's when trouble arises, particularly, of course, if they're not biodegradable. But if something's really not polar at all, very often they're more degradable. But the slightly polar, very lipophilic molecules seem to be the kind that end up being particularly bad as PBT or substances of very high concern for the environment. And so that was
Mm.
quite interesting to do. And I've certainly found Hansen parameters has been a great way of grouping molecules because they deal in absolute energies. They're not relative, whereas a partition coefficient is relative. So
Mm.
partition coefficient is the relative attraction of something between water with octanol in it and octanol with water in it. And that's the partition process, which is very interesting in that it relates to all sorts of biological phenomena.
Mm.
Whereas the Hansen parameters give you an absolute dispersion energy or an absolute hydrogen bonding energy and an absolute polarity related energy. And so they're not relative. And so they can reveal absolute truths rather than being relative truths. And so they bring a different. So it's not a case of both and.
Yeah.
The partitioning is still useful, but things like Hansen is very useful. And Hansen has been, for example, very good at predicting corrosivity to the eye.
All right.
That's been published by people
Very good.
to link to show that corrosivity and irritation to the eye is related to the Hansen properties. I think is something that people should have picked up on more, to be honest. But that's
Yeah.
been published several years ago now, I think. And I was very pleased in the last year or two, did some work with a flame retardant sector, and there was pressure from some groups of people to link all flame retardants into one group for regulatory purposes. And you can show using the Hansen parameters that the properties of different flame retardants are reflected in their grouping in Hansen space is very different. And I was very pleased that, in fact, in one of the restriction documents from ECHA, that they recognised that not all FRs are the same.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think that was interesting to do, and I really should try and find the time to publish more about Hansen.
It
But
does sound like it, yeah. Hopefully, this podcast episode will help to get the word out a little bit more on
well,
that.
um, Yeah, so it's been for me in the last few years a pleasure to work with um, the people that promote handsome parameters for the last few years, but their interest is a lot more in describing performance of chemicals rather than the environmental side or the health side. But that's been quite exciting to do something new, and takes me right back to the start. Is that I'm still fundamentally interested in molecular properties expressed in physical chemistry. So it feels like coming back round full circle.
Yeah, you've come full circle. Brilliant. Peter, I did want to talk to you. I mean, you've brought up Steve Robertson a number of times in the discussion, and I'm aware that he did pass away recently, and that you gave a nice tribute to him on LinkedIn. So I just wonder if you could talk a bit more about
Well,
the impact that he had.
yeah, and I think since then, former colleagues of his, particularly Jane Cayley, who's at ECHA, has put together an article which is going in as a guest editorial into the CTAC journal at some point, and it might
Mm.
already have happened. I don't know. I know that's quite an in-depth tribute to him.
Hmm.
Um, but the basic thing about him that was where he was unique in many levels, one was that everything he achieved was against a backdrop of multiple disabilities that would cause most ordinary people to have just sat at home, and which he never did. And he went around representing the UK around Europe under physical hardship that would frighten most people. At the same time, he had a steely determination, but he had the advantage of being right most of the time about his analysis, but he would be big enough to admit when he was wrong. So he was involved in the teams at the European Chemicals Bureau that wrote a lot of the environmental regulation and the risk assessment methodologies. That if you look at the REACH guidance, um, it's still there. It's the same words that were written 25 years ago, of which Steve was part. Nobody has seen fit to edit it because it's stood the test of time.
Mm.
And of course, it wasn't just him; it was a team, and one could name many names of people that were involved in that. One thing that Steve, was very interested in, where he did change his mind, was about in the ecotox testing of difficult substances. And the UK, by working with Unilever Research, produced a report about how to deal with complex substances way back. And on it, Steve had believed that it was okay to dose at levels above the nominal water solubility of substances in complex mixtures and so on. But they devised a research program involving a lot of radio labeled substances with the Unilever subcontractors, and it was shown that the dissolved content was explaining the ecotox results, and Steve had to change his interpretation, and that approach is sort of still very much there in the guidance on the
Mm.
back of the work that he did. But I think his so that would be one big area of achievement. But he just had a razor sharp mind, and
Mm.
that he could see to the root issues in understanding a substance very quickly. Indeed, and as I say, he did. As I said about an hour ago, he did not view this as regulatory compliance as any kind of a game, because he recognized that financial viability of industry
Mm.
depended upon good decision making, and recognizing that protecting the environment from the worst substances had to be done. At the same time, you should recognize you might make somebody out of work if you make a particular decision
Hmm.
on a substance. So he recognised the seriousness at the same time. And I think he had a very, probably less well known, but he did have a very good grip of biodegradation testing as well. What are the right approaches? Which types of study? What did they mean? But he was an out and out chemist originally. But I would recommend you track down there's a multi-author tribute to him that I guess must have been published in Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry by now.
I think it was a few months ago, but
Yeah.
it's very good to hear your own
So,
account.
well, I don't think I'm telling you anything that's particularly different there, but I think he was also, when he retired from the Environment Agency, there were people queuing up to use him as a consultant, and he refused every one on two grounds. One is he wanted to spend more time doing things like watching cricket or reading or listening to music, all of those things that he was keen to do, spend more time with his family as well. But he felt that he'd seen so much industry confidential data over the years that how could he, as a consultant, ever actually not be using that information, even subconsciously. So if you've seen something, you might be thinking in your back of your mind, well, I remember that substance blah, and we did this and this happened. Perhaps we should do the same. Well, he would have regarded that as not an ethical thing to do. Whereas there are very few people who would have taken such a sort of high-minded attitude. So he disappointed a lot of people by turning them all down. And
sounds like a very principled, nice person. It would have been nice to have met him.
Yeah, it was indeed a privilege, and of course there are still quite a few people around like me that benefited hugely from knowing him, and some of them are still working for regulatory agencies. So I think that's as much as I need to say, but I think
Yes.
I can't understate how privileged I was to have known him.
Yes. Thank you for that, Peter. I really appreciate that. And one thing I want to bring out in this podcast is not only the accounts of the individuals that I'm speaking to, but also the individuals that have had an impact on them and on the area that we're working in. And it sounds like Steve was definitely fitting that
Yes,
description.
there are many names that I can think of, but it would be a poor reflection on the people that I can't remember to start naming names. But I do think one of the most positive things in my career is the fact that people have been able to move from being in this company to that company, or from that company to this regulator, and still carried on being objective. And I've appreciated that. I'm not saying that everyone is like that, but I think that the vast majority have behaved in scientifically unprejudiced ways, and so therefore you have to believe that if there are things you don't feel comfortable about, it's not that people are out to get you, it's just they're doing their jobs according to what the regulation presents them. And that if I was on the other side of the debate, I end up making the same decision as them. And after all, we've seen many times that things that have been taken to the European Court, the authorities have been justified as having been shown to follow the regulation exactly. And so I think we have to recognise that there isn't a willful nastiness, but sometimes regulation is not as well crafted as it could be.
Yeah, I do fear that in the 30 or so years that we've had between then and now, there has been something of a decline, a degradation of principles and objectivity in the practice of people working in our area, and I think partially that's because it hasn't been the emphasis on the responsibility that we all have to act as
Yeah,
scientists and embrace the values of the
yeah.
Enlightenment movement.
Certainly, I was involved in something at the minute recently where not really green chemistry, this one, but
Mm,
nevertheless, you read it and you think, well, actually, this is a very well crafted letter from the authorities, and they've obviously thought about it very hard. And you can see there's a lot of logic in the approach. And this would be an excellent framework for someone to do a master's project. But nobody has asked the question, if I got this answer or that answer, would it change anything? And I think that's what I find disappointing, is that no people are sending letters out saying do this, do that, and no one's actually thinking what difference will it make according to what answer I get.
mm,
And so you end up seeing, it's as though people have sat in a room and said, oh, well, we're asking for this and this, so I think we maybe should ask for that, that, and that as well. And suddenly you see a testing bill that's going to be €1 million, when probably you could have got to a satisfactory or sufficient answer for 50,000.
yeah.
And
This is the bureaucracy of the regulation, and that is what it says, right? And it's the same answer. It's a box ticking. It lacks that pragmatism that was available before, unfortunately.
yeah, I think that's a lack of willingness to think through to the consequences.
Mm,
We've all sat in rooms, I'm sure, where you'd listen to two scientists or two lawyers or two economists or two politicians or,
mm,
sitting arguing about something. And then you say to them, well, if you're right, what's the consequence? And if that other person is right, what's the consequence? And when they say, well, it's the same, we think, well, in which case, does it matter? And yet there's still, as you say, box ticking or not thinking through to the consequences of something. And I think it is part of the reason why, as opposed to the expectation of 2007, which said that REACH will speed regulatory compliance up. Well, patently, it has not. There can't be a single person in regulatory chemistry who believes that REACH works fast enough. Is there?
no.
I've not met one.
Well, I mean, I think that's the thing. It's being criticised from all angles, isn't it? Because the people who would like more progress on regulating chemicals are equally, if not more, unhappy with the progress that's being made. So
Yeah, yeah.
that is a
So
problem.
I think yes, and if that's one thing that would disappoint by observation, is that uh, people from NGOs have got very, very valid things to say, but I think they drift into extreme bias that means that regulators and industry don't listen to them as much as they should. They've got good, important things to say,
Mm,
but because they're expressed so tendentiously, they don't get listened to as much as they should do. And that to me is a shame. And that doesn't mean all people working for NGOs. There are some very good people, but too many people have this ludicrous idea that all chemicals should be banned or something.
mm,
It appears to be an element of that still out there, and to me, that's been a disappointment in my career to not see those, to see that there are barriers exist
mm.
with that community, and I feel that that's sad because those people are bringing an ethical
Yes.
imperative that everybody else should be listening to. And coming back to Steve Robertson, that's where he was extremely good. Um, I remember in the way that it used to work in the old regulations, the UK would look at the data set of a substance submitted in the UK, a new substance, and would say, this is what you should test at the level above the basic registration data set. And Steve was very good at saying, well, we're going to just do the chronic Daphnia and see what happens. Whereas certain other countries would say, we are going to do the chronic Daphnia and the chronic fish because that's more informative. Whereas Steve would take the view is that a fish is a vertebrate and we're not going to do the chronic fish until we've got more knowledge about this substance. And so he was very, very against things like doing bioaccumulation studies that would use a lot of fish in those days. And similarly with chronic fish tests, where if you did the long-term Daphnia and it showed that you had a problem and that the people likely had a risk that was unacceptable, that they had to say how they were going to control that risk before he would come in saying, well, okay, now you've got to do the chronic fish. Because he would say, well, let them sort out their releases before we ask for the fish test, for the obvious ethical reason. Whereas a lot of the other countries would just say, do the fish Daphnia and a sediment test and this and that. Whereas he would say, does it change the outcome? Because if they can't get the releases down below an acceptable level, then we've asked them to do a fish test unnecessarily. And what they should do is give up on the substance. So, I think there's another kind of nuance there that perhaps people don't realize, but he was extremely good at understanding the vertebrate related imperative. Well, do you have any more questions? I've gone on for a long time.
I mean, it's been fascinating, Peter, and to an extent, I've wanted to just let you run because I knew that this conversation would take many, many twists and turns, and I think it could go on for another hour and a half if we wanted it to. But maybe we should wrap it up, and perhaps we'll save the rest for another time. What I do normally do to wrap up, and the first thing I want to say again is thank you so much for joining the call and sharing all these perspectives and insights. I think within this, you've given a really honest account of how you've seen the last 20 to 30 years of regulatory policy around chemicals play out. And, to many extents, it seems like there have been some unintended consequences, let's say, and also the fact that it has been an enormous bureaucracy that's been set up around this regulation. It has perhaps given people too much cover, let's say, to fall in behind what it says in the legal text and not able perhaps to step forward and take pragmatic judgments where they feel they should.
In the interest of balance, one thing that I would say, and certainly experienced in running consortia, is the mechanism whereby hundreds and hundreds of studies that were sitting inside company filing cabinets, unknown to the rest of the world. The process within REACH whereby all that information has come out because it had to, and also people were financially rewarded for bringing it out.
Yes.
Within a consortium, that was wholly successful.
Yes,
and admittedly, it was slow at start as people were taking time to prove that their substances were the same or sufficiently the same. But once you got through that and the reports started coming out, it was amazing that even within, say, Cefic sector groups, not naming anyone, where information data call-ins had been done in the past, well, even then, the amount of information that came out doubled, even compared to data call-ins that they'd had on a voluntary basis. Suddenly, the amount that came out was amazing. And so it's a huge success of REACH that the information came out of the filing cabinets, and there's no doubt about that. Whether we can then make enough use of it all in terms of read across and QSARs and grouping is another matter. Yes. But I think it's important to throw that in that REACH was very successful in that respect, and
Absolutely.
yeah.
I fully agree with that aspect, Peter. The distance we've gone in terms of understanding the properties of different chemicals through the publication of REACH registration data, I think, has been immeasurable. And I agree with you that we need to do more to be able to mine that information to gain insights so that we can understand even more about chemical hazards and risks. The other thing that I wanted to say was that my feeling is that I think you mentioned about we seem to be in a critical point where both within the EU and in the UK there seems to be some soul searching about what we're going to do moving forward in terms of chemicals management. I have a fear about the evolution of REACH in that there is a precautionary approach overlying everything, and things are not fixed in time, in that guidance continues to evolve, situations continue to be refined, and this precautionary approach can progressively render things more conservative. And I also am concerned about the backlash against from the PFAS situation, in that how that is going to impact other chemicals that are on the market that are going to be tarred in a similar way when they don't fit the same characteristics. So those are kind of two of my thoughts about
Yes.
the
No,
direction of travel.
I agree with you when you see things written that somebody that thinks that a chemical that perhaps slowly passes an inherent biodegradability test, but is not very degradable. They kind of think that it's another PFAS coming along. No, 10% degradation in 60 days is an awful lot different from no degradation ever. And so I think that does concern me about the sort of lack of scientific understanding on things like that. Yeah.
If there was one recommendation you could make about the if there is to be any simplification or revision of REACH to address some of the concerns that you have, is it on the end of your tongue?
Um, well, I would say go back to a mentality of risk-based assessment that's true risk-based assessment, and not be pushing all the time towards hazard-based. That would be my biggest wish, um, because it's about the reality of the degree of exposure. Um, Surely one of the oldest scientific understandings ever made, going back to the ancient Greeks, wasn't it, about the importance of the exposure, not just the strength of the poison. So I think that seems to have been the most retrograde thing for me. That's what I would plead for, without a great deal of confidence of success.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't know how much hope I have for that horse.
Um,
Seems to have bolted, but yeah.
yeah, there's probably other things that cross my mind, but if they do, I'll message you.
Yeah, we can
but,
continue this conversation in some form or another, I'm sure, because yeah,
but
and I think we, I hope that perspectives like this, which get aired in conference halls at posters, but perhaps not more broadly, can be heard by someone. Anyway, just to wrap up, Peter, I ask all my guests a couple of rapid fire questions at the end. So the first one is, and this can be a personal, professional context. What is a big goal that you're working towards in the coming months?
well, I think I already hinted that to be involved in this project for DG Grow about the possibility of building a range of centres of expertise, or a network of centres of expertise regarding sustainability. I think doing my best within my small part in that is a big. Did you want one or two things?
Well, that was the first
That's
question.
okay.
Yeah,
That's the main thing that's on my mind, as well as finishing writing some papers.
very good. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other question is one piece of advice that you'd give either to yourself or somebody else starting out on their career.
I think that most people will underestimate their capability. And so, therefore, I would say I'm going to link two things here. Don't fight battles that you don't need to. In other words, don't try and imagine everything that's going to happen in advance, because what actually happens won't be what you thought.
Mm.
But then at the same time, your answer to most questions as a budding consultant is yes, in principle, and you can do it unless you know that you really can't, because probably you will be able to do it. If you're a good intelligent scientist, you probably will be able to learn enough toxicology that's sufficient for a purpose, or enough biodegradability science or metabolism stuff, whatever. So believe in yourself to say yes, I think is essential for anybody in a scientific career, because your training in logic and analysis will see you through, most likely. Of course, it's disastrous if you say yes to something you really can't do, but the number of times that happens is probably quite few.
Yes, that's a really good piece of advice, Peter. Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to wrap up there. So thanks very much again, Peter, for joining the podcast. It's been fantastic. Thanks, everybody who's been listening. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. Your time's really precious, so I'm really grateful that you've spent it with us. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please follow it and tell your friends and colleagues about it. We've got more conversations like this to follow, so stay tuned for the Chemical Journeys podcast. Thanks a lot, Peter.
Bye.